Hello, friends of the European spirit. You may have seen that recently, again online at least, the old quarrel or perhaps even outright hatred between analytic and continental philosophy, or should we say analytic and continental academic philosophers, has flared up again. Now, when and why and how that all started matters not really. What does matter, though, is to consider what really analytic philosophy is at its core and why it is at a dead end, according to one of their own, Peter Unger, who published a book about a decade ago with the foreboding title Empty Ideas, a Critique of Analytic Philosophy. Now, you may also have seen Ellie Anderson's Substack article on the fetish of clarity, which one could say, to be fair, there certainly is a sort of, exaggeration of clarity in analytic philosophy. There's a focus on it and the attempt to make ideas clear, etc. But that is not the fundamental issue, I think, with so-called analytic philosophy. And whether it's a fetish or not, I think that's also besides the point, because that looks at the people involved rather than the heart of the matter. We're looking for die Sache here. So let's consider also another point that Ellie Anderson made in her Substack, which is that analytic philosophy, she maintains, is based on correspondence truth, which is to say, and this is overly simplifying matters, that a representation or judgment of a subject corresponds to an object out there, and hence there's a justified true belief, etc. Now, I would say to that, if only. That would be actually good, because that would mean that analytic philosophy would actually consider quote-unquote reality or actuality or beings as they may be. Now, there's certainly naive realism to go around, but there is not concern with saving the phenomena, as we might put it, on the continent. And I should perhaps also be clear myself here that proper continental philosophy is not Judith Butler. So we don't talk about this Americanization of European thought. We should be very careful with that. Also, you might even include Derrida in this conundrum. So continental philosophy, we have to distinguish here from what's sold as continental philosophy in pop culture, really. Would include Hegel and Heidegger and Nietzsche and a few others who speak out of a tradition and are within that tradition and don't try to present, let's just put it carefully, a certain ideology. And there is definitely obscurantism on that side of the aisle of continental philosophy that is considered continental philosophy for the most part today. But neither Hegel nor Heidegger, I would say, are in any sense obscurantists, but the ideas that they grapple with are difficult to articulate. And that's putting it mildly. And again, oversimplifying matters, but for the sake of argument here, what I'm trying to get to is what is actually at the core of continental philosophy, what is its heart, and what is the heart of the matter of analytic philosophy and why they are so distinct. And it's rather simple. Analytic philosophy has a monetary logic. And I'll get to what I mean by this in a second. But let's just see what Peter Unger himself points out in his book, Empty Ideas. Now, he has become, at least that's what he said at the time, that he'd become quite pessimistic about philosophy. But still, the question is why? Because, as he says, there's almost no concretely substantial ideas, which is to say that there is no information about concrete reality. The ideas are empty. So to translate that, analytic philosophy is incapable of saving the phenomena, which is the task of philosophy as such. The task, above all, of philosophy is to save the phenomena. Now, whether Derrida and Judith Butler and others save the phenomena, that's perhaps for another time to discuss. So maybe there is some obscurantism. But you have to then ask why. And I would say that so-called Continental philosophy, Hegel, Heidegger, etc., proper phenomenology, Husserl included, that is at least the attempt. There is at least the attempt to save the phenomena. Those who don't save the phenomena, by the way, are the sophists in ancient Greece. So, again, if only analytic philosophy held itself to correspondence truth, that would tie their ideas and formal logic to experience. But that's not what happens. And instead, and why do I say it's a monetary logic? Now think about it in this way. You have a $100 bill, and with that $100 or £100 or €100, etc., you can buy a pair of shoes, you can buy several books, you could buy a watch, you could go out for dinner, or you could put it in a savings account. It's a means of exchange. And in a similar fashion, analytic philosophy operates with formal logic. Arbitrary, almost random application, purely of any argument, is just on itself, or maybe even random phenomena, without letting the phenomena speak for themselves. That is the approach of analytic philosophy. At its very heart, it is ultimately a monetary logic. If you want to exaggerate a little bit, you could say it's the hyper-financialization of formal logic. Now Kant, the old Kant, tried to tie formal logic to experience. That's the Kantian revolution in a nutshell. To tie formal logic to experience. And so you could almost lay the blame, to some extent at least, at his feet. Also because, for example, the categorical imperative is really a test on how to avoid contradiction, on how to uphold, hence, the principle of non-contradiction. And hence, at the very heart of perhaps what we see in analytic philosophy is, to some extent, at least some form of Kantianism, let's say. And there's an example, by the way. So Korsgaard wrote many papers, of course. He wrote many papers and books, but one of them is on the murderer at the door. Now, people who have read a bit of Kant will know about the murderer at the door. There's a long video lecture on my channel, by the way, on the murderer at the door in Kant. By the way, if you want to understand Kant better and what the Kantian revolution is about, take my course on Kant for the link in the description of this video. So Korsgaard, in her paper, takes the different formulations of the categorical imperative and applies them almost at random to the situation of the murderer coming to your door, asking for your friend to be murdered, etc. And, you know, as Kant polemically says, you must tell the truth. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here. I've done that elsewhere. But in a sense, this is just an illustration of how Kantian, or Kantianistic, if you like, formalistic logic, randomly applied to certain situations, leads to absurd outcomes. And of course, Unger takes the whole thing a little bit further. Even for him, it's clear that ultimately what quote-unquote modern epistemology, metaphysics, etc., are dealing with is empty ideas. Now you could take this even a bit further, and you could tie this to modern contemporary subjectivism. Because in some sense, Aristotle and Plato, of course, also a priori determine ontology. But for example, because of the way in which, because there is access, genuine access to the world, ontology is not an abstract enterprise. It is ultimately articulating reality, what there is, and what there is, and also what is actual. So the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy, I think, really is ultimately that one. Is an analytic philosophy because of its financialized use of formal logic, because of its monetary logic, is incapable and will always be incapable of saving the phenomena. So it's strictly speaking, analytic philosophy is not philosophy. And that is, by the way, on the so-called quote-unquote continental side, if the attempt is not to save the phenomena, and again, this is perhaps putting it a bit too simple, but if you think of Hegel's Science of Logic, for example, the attempt, of course, is not primarily to save, quote unquote, save the phenomena, but to derive the categories of thought from thought itself. And that is done, however, because our experience is shot through with categories. And hence, we must understand, even becoming is a category for Hegel, we must understand where the categories come from, because we think. And we are thinking beings. We are, to speak with Hegel, the being that the concept that understands itself, Logos that understands itself, der Begriff, der sich selbst versteht, der sich selbst begreift, grasps itself, you could almost say, perhaps. Maybe that's better. So the attempt then in the logic, and this is again oversimplifying it, is at least to some extent, one could say, is to try and maybe not directly save the phenomena, but to allow, to show that thinking and being really are the same. There's a unity between the two. And hence, there are actually substantial ideas. So this is what Peter Unger, and he's very honest, you have to hand it to him, he's one of them, and he very honestly saw that happen, arrived at this position. I'm just looking at his book again, arrived at this position, and that there is a predominance of empty ideas that don't grant anything about concrete reality. And thus, again, it is in some sense monetary, because you could use formal logic and apply formal logic in its argumentation on any situation, or even just on itself, and either end up in absurd outcomes or empty ideas about empty ideas. Or you could try and let, in a phenomenological manner, let the phenomena speak for themselves. So continental philosophy would be Hegel, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was a Herder. To some extent, of course, also Kant. Heidegger, Nietzsche, and a few others. Husserl, Paul Natorp. And after that means after, let's say in the second half of the 20th century, it does turn into something else. Yeah, so the criticism that's leveled against Butler, etc., that's all fair. There's obscurantism, etc., but that doesn't have to concern us here. What has to concern us here is, and this is an invitation ultimately to analytic philosophers, it's not a criticism that is just trying to be witty and funny. I'm trying to ultimately open a sort of dialogue, perhaps, between those on both sides who are concerned with not ideology of any sort, but with the truth.